Have you ever been working on a Tableau dashboard and then been frustrated that you couldn't resize an object or move it precisely where you wanted because the tools just didn't seem to let you edit it? My name is Peter Empey, and today I'm going to talk to you about why that might be happening and go over some of the tools and controls you have in the Tableau to lay out your objects on your dashboard. So let's get started by just looking at what we have. We'll do that with starting at a blank dashboard. We'll start by looking on the dashboard tab. There is an object within Tableau called a layout, and that has to do with more of the screen size. So you can select if your screen size is smaller, the objects will move around and be laid out in a different way. And we can find those by looking at the device previews. And we can say add a desktop layout. And we can see that here. But we can always be a default layout. So if we're not worried about making sure we have the content laid out differently for mobile or desktop, we don't have to worry about this too much. We'll just delete that layout and turn off that device preview. Now we also have these objects here, and these objects go onto the dashboard. And let's talk about them for a minute. The first thing I like to talk about is this selection here, whether it's tiled or floating. This controls how the objects behave when they're placed on the dashboard. A tiled object will behave. How will it behave? It will get along with its neighbors. It will try and fit to the space that it's in, but it will also pay attention to its neighbors, and they'll all try and fit in this space together. Floating objects will layer on top of each other and ignore the space around, ignore the objects around them. They'll only be the size you tell them to be. So, and we have all of these objects. These all go onto the dashboard. Let's just drag one out so we see what that looks like. So when an object is tiled, it will fill the whole space. There's nothing else to restrict it, so it filled the whole space. But let's take a look at these object properties, which we find on the Layout tab. It's more like an Object Properties tab, but don't worry about the naming. So here we see it's filled the size, filled the position, set a position kind of in the top corner based on some of these other parameters. But if we check this box here and we turn it into a floating object, we can see that it will just pick a set. There's a set height and a position for it. Now once it's floating, we can move it around. We can see that its position changes, and we can also resize it. And we can see that these sizes change as well. Great. That's the first thing we need to know. We'll put this guy over here. We'll give him a border so we can always find him later. But let's go back to our dashboard tab and take a look at a couple of these other objects. These are going to be important to our layout tools. And so that's these horizontal and vertical containers. Let's drag out the vertical container, make sure that it's floating so that it doesn't fill all the space. So here we have it. We're going to give him a border too, just so we can find him easily. And inside of it, we're going to go ahead and put some more objects. We're going to make sure that they're tiled so that they will live within that container. Now when you put a tiled object inside a container, you're actually creating a parent-child relationship. So you're kind of surrendering some of the properties of the object to its parent. And we can see that. Now we have one of these objects selected. We'll go here. Let's give all of these a border so we can see how they relate to each other easily. And we have one of them selected. We can see that these objects' properties are here, but we can't edit them. And that's because it's not floating. These properties are only available when an object is floating. So if we select the container, which we know is floating, by either double clicking on this tab of an object, or by going to this menu and selecting the container, we can see that we can edit these. So let's make this a nice square, make it 400 high. No problem. But these objects that are inside the container, we can't change. We can also see that they're inside this container with this item hierarchy. They're kind of nested underneath this. How do we adjust the size of the objects within this container? Well, we saw that we can change the size of the whole container and all the objects grow to fit. But what if we want this object to be bigger than all the others? We know we can't change it here, but if we come here to the context menu for this object, found by either this More Options button or by simply right-clicking on the object, we find that we can edit its height. When we do that, we can just type in a number. I want this one to be 200. So we can see that we type in the number and it changes. It will fill that space. We also see that this pin is now highlighted, meaning that the height has been fixed. These other objects don't have their height fixed. They will continue to resize as we add other objects, whereas this one will stay the same size. I like to use this once I have the proportions for my chart or my other objects. I will fix their size within that container so that as I add new ones, they don't squish around more than they have to. Now, if you try and give everything a size bigger than the container, they're going to start just shrinking down, maybe behaving more proportionally. Let's take a look. So this one is 200, we have 99 and 99. If I try and make this one, this height 200, we see that these two are the same in relationship to each other, but they're not 200 high. They have been forced to shrink smaller. And this one is 32. What happens if we make this one 200? We're back to where we started. They all have a fixed height, but none of them are 200. So it's important to leave some space to squish and flow when you're using them if you want to better control their height. At least that's what I've found. So floating objects let you control the position and size precisely. Tiled objects, when they're in containers, you're able to have control over their size and their relationship to the other objects within the container. I want to show you a couple examples of where I find these different tool sets, different ways of using the tools are effective. So the first one is with all floating objects. This isn't a good infographic by any means. It's really not my forte, but this is where I find using all floating objects to be very effective. You can place an object exactly where you need it to be, and it stays there, and it doesn't impact anything else around it. We'll show you by actually getting a floating object. We put it out there. We'll close that menu for a moment, and we can just put it there. It doesn't impact. I put everything precisely where I wanted it. Everything's great. This is less effective of a way of using these tools, I find, for more business-related dashboards. So here's an example of a business dashboard. And I like to use tiled objects within containers for this situation because it lets me make sure these things are perfectly aligned. I can control all the spaces around them without having to think so much and go and edit every single position precisely. What if we aren't using the tools in this way? What happens? Well, it kind of leads to that frustration we talked about in the beginning. So let's look at a dashboard. And all of these objects are tiled, but there's no containers. We can see that by looking at this item hierarchy. There's no containers, vertical or horizontal, in here. But it looks okay. Everything is lined up. It was easy to drag it, then put these out here. But what if we're told that this title block needs to be a certain height, say 120? Well, because it's not floating, we can't edit it here. And because it's not in a container, we don't have the option to edit the height precisely here. So all we're left with is finding the edge and trying to guess and get it as close as possible. And it's hard. Oh, bracket 114. Sometimes you can get lucky and get it precisely on 120, like I did just now. But it's kind of fiddly and really hard to control, or if you're in a hurry to get that to work just right. So let's take a look at this situation when we're using the objects in the other ways we talked about, all floating or tiled with containers. So here's the same dashboard, but everything on here is floating. Everything has been placed precisely right where we wanted it. But now we're told this title block needs to be 120 high. Well, we just come over here, edit the height, and we're off. We're done. Something to remember in this particular situation, if we look carefully, we can see that these objects are now overlapping. In this situation, it's not a big deal, but you want to remember that this is the intended behavior of floating objects. Change the size too much and the content might start overlapping in ways you don't want. Now let's take a look at the tiled with containers situation. Here everything is tiled and they're in containers, and we can verify that in the item hierarchy here. Same dashboard, same problem, we want to change this to be 120 high. We know we can't edit it here, but because it's in a container, we can come up here to its properties and edit the height. We type in 120 and it changes. And you'll notice that these all shrink just a little bit to adjust for that change in size. This is the intended behavior, and you should know that so that you're not surprised when you're trying to design your dashboard. So with these tools and the information about them, you should be able to create any dashboard that you need and hopefully reduce the amount of frustration from trying to get that pixel perfect precision from your dashboard. These have been struggles that I've had, and I'm glad I could share my knowledge with you. Hopefully this will help you as you strive to build and create all of the things that you need. Thank you for listening. I hope that you've learned something.